Welcome, everybody. It is August, and I don't know if it's warm where you are, but it's warm where we are, and we found the most amazing thing. It gets hot almost every August. I know. Go figure. Now, I find it really interesting because on the news, they're always talking about, oh my gosh, it's hot today. I'm like, well, yeah, no kidding. All right, but here's what we're going to do today. Last week, we sort of started with this idea of looking at certain parts of the United States and saying how good or bad is it to practice there. And I'm not handling the places that we get most requests for. I'm kind of going into those areas that we don't, and I'm clustering some states together into natural regions. And today we're going to be talking about New England. Now, some people go, oh, New England, it's so lovely, particularly in August. By the way, it's hot in New England during this time of year too, in case you don't know. But it's not one of the places that we get a lot of requests for. But there seems to be kind of the graduating time where there are so many schools that are graduating people. We get a lot of, all of a sudden, a big uptick. And I thought this would be a good thing for the record. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through a little bit of what is going on in New England and what its potential might be in the marketplace. It is really hard, I'm going to full confession here, to get really enthusiastic about some locations that seem to have a death wish. And New England has a death wish. It has got this desire not to grow. And that's kind of sad because the potential in New England is fantastic. So let's talk about what's the real potential of having a practice of any type within New England. Now, just for fun, everybody probably knows there are 6 states in New England. Those are Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. Each one of them was basically founded by a different religion. I don't know if you know that or not, but they became kind of religious colonies, and the ethic that came from the founders sort of followed along. So whether you're Anglican or well, I won't go through all. Anyway, but it made a difference as to what the attitude of the people were there. And some people say, well, that doesn't exist anymore because not many people are religious. Well, the fact is, the people who founded these places and their ethnic heritage still make a difference. Now, you can probably throw a rock from one side of Rhode Island to another. It was one of those things that is a joke when I was going over the bridge to get into Rhode Island once. Somebody had put a sign up, Rhode Island closed today. Is it really that small? Can they do that? Well, it isn't very big, and really it consists of only a few cities. Massachusetts, on the other hand, is the big dog. Now, let's kind of make sure you understand that when we're looking at them, the geographic area, the topography is not that different. They tend to have that Atlantic coastal thing going on, and they do all pretty have cold winters. That is true. But other than that, there are differences as you go from the northern side of Maine down to Connecticut, and it can be quite significant in terms of the weather and the business potential. So let me just keep going here. Between 1958 and 2018, a lot of people did these studies to say, how is the region that we're looking at doing? Now, as you'll note, it goes from the left to the right, and it looks like, generally speaking, New England is gaining in population, which it is. The net gain in those years was 4,634,290. Or in other words, since that period of time, it went up 45.3%. And any reasonable person would say, oh, that's not bad. New England seems to be doing okay. The only little problem is it's not doing well relative to the rest of the United States. So as you'll note, the rest of the United States is that green line that kind of kept rising. And back in 1970 or so, New England sort of stopped growing. And you may say, well, why would it do that? It did it because there was a big election, and the New England stopped being kind of mixed Republican Democrat and conservative and liberal. It kind of became liberal, and then even more liberal. And then it became even more liberal. So the state houses and the governors kind of got into the feeling that it is possible to tax yourself into prosperity. It happened that a lot of the government leaders didn't want to put growth on the backs of the people. They thought they'd do it on the backs of business. Well, as I'll explain a little bit later, that doesn't really work because in the end, people are both businesses and individuals, and practices started dropping off as well. So the growth rate, not just the population, but also the development growth, sort of stopped, and it's kind of gone backward. In the 1970s, 1975 to about 1979, that's when it really took a hit in the gut. And so New England had a problem. They were sort of under the assumption that everything was going to go fantastic and everything was just going to be great. Now, it's not as though New England stopped growing. It did keep growing. But relative to the rest of the United States, it didn't keep growing as fast. And so even though it had 45% more or less, the rest of the country was growing at like 85% since that period of time. And so the feeling is New England hasn't been keeping up. And it is true that it makes it much easier to go to other locations in order to have a practice in which to live. Now, there are a few factors, and I'm going to take a little time on each of these so you'll understand what I'm really talking about, and then I'll talk about some specifics about the area, within New England. Now, far and away, Massachusetts is the big dog. It represents about 65% of the growth and development of New England. And even then, Massachusetts is primarily growing at the Atlantic side, which is the eastern side of the state. That, and I'll talk more specifically about that, but really to know New England is to know how Massachusetts is going. The rest of the New England states, the other five, really are not growing all that much, but more importantly, they're not developing all that much. Now, a lot of the doctors will say, well, I want to go to a place that has fantastic compensation rates. I love that. I understand. But the problem is the cost of doing business and the cost of living in all of these states, with the special point of Massachusetts, is it's more and more expensive to live and to operate a business here. And one of the things that's sort of funny is a lot of people who are in the government don't care. It's like, well, we're always going to be big. We're always going to be successful. Live with it, which is not a great thing, because what we're discussing as we go through different parts of the country, there are some states that are growing fantastically well, and they're really welcoming of people from outside the area. Not so much true in New England overall. Massachusetts, by the way, is much more cosmopolitan. And as you probably know, the biggest population of immigrants to move into Massachusetts are from, where are they from? That's right, Latin America. Puerto Rico is the largest contributor to people from other countries, but right after that is Europe. Now, when Europe is not really growing and then shipping people out, New England suffers. When all of a sudden it's doing well as far as its population, New England benefits. One of the odd things to let you know is the small towns are getting smaller, and the big cities are doing bigger. They're getting better. So if you're thinking about setting up a practice within New England, you can actually find several good locations to go to, but they're almost always going to be the top 5 or 10 in terms of population, and that's where you have to consider going. That isn't true in most of the rest of the country, where rural or semi-rural or even suburban neighborhoods are the ones that people look for. That's a problem in New England. Now, each of the states, of the 6, have a different potential and a different character. Part of it is different as far as the kinds of businesses that are located there. Now, I'm probably not surprising you when I say Connecticut, it has been for a long time a financial services center. It was very close to New York City, and people would take the train up there all the time. Beautiful properties in Connecticut, absolutely fantastic. But that idea that somehow we don't want to make this an easy place for finances just means that they're taking so much money in taxes out. And we'll talk about the tax rates in just a second because it's important. Another demographic factor you have to know about New England is age. Now, the issue here is the birth rate. Now, when people retire, going to New England was just wonderful. People would go antiquing and they'd have these beautiful places that they would go to. And that's fantastic. The problem is they weren't having kids to replace the older people. And so New England overall has gotten older. This age increase, particularly in states like Vermont and most especially Maine, has made them so that they're very difficult places to own a business, and especially to own a practice. As I'll mention later, if you happen to be in a business that requires lots of kids, like a pedo practice or an ortho practice, it can be a long day. The other thing that is I mentioned is characteristic of the region is the high tax rates. As I'll mention, of the top 10 highest tax states, 4 of them are in New England. And we'll talk specifically about who those are. And as the birth rate declines, New England is becoming increasingly dependent upon immigrants. Now, the immigrant population, we always assume are people who come from somewhere else. And a lot of people assume that that means coming from a foreign country. In New England, it really does. So a lot of times the people who are the immigrant population are not people who come from other parts of the United States. In fact, the population of people who come from other parts of the United States is actually going down. And so they're more and more dependent upon foreign people to come in. Now that's an opportunity if you own a practice and you happen to speak another language. So those people who speak Spanish, great, you have an advantage. People who speak French or German also have a bit of an advantage. Interestingly enough, the biggest European import of population are English speakers, and they come from Great Britain. Brexit has made a lot of people nervous in Great Britain. Where are we going? What are we going to do? And so the United States said, hey, you want to have a business? Come on down, we'll take care of you. And so these are some of the factors that we're talking about. Now, let me go through each of these a little bit further. If we look at Massachusetts, which I call the big dog, you look at Suffolk County, which is on that eastern side, and Norfolk and Middlesex are also fairly large. Plymouth County has not grown nearly as much, but for the most part, people who are coming out of the New York area drive up through Bristol and Plymouth counties to get up to Norfolk, and that's where the train runs. It's not like that's the only place to go within Massachusetts, but if you want to buy a practice, the places that are most going to have the largest number of practices for sale, Suffolk, Norfolk, and even right now Plymouth, have a number of practices for sale. Now let's talk about those cities within the state. Boston, and you can't really tell the difference between Boston and Cambridge. They hate it when I say that. But it's just generally true that they kind of have the same vibe. Lots of schools, well-educated people, great research facilities, banks, and other things that are there. That's great. But you get out of that area and it becomes a little more difficult in order to figure out where to go. Now, obviously, Boston's going to be the big city. But if you look at Worcester, that's the second biggest with about 185,000 people. And as you'll see, that's right in the middle of the state. It's kind of on the outer border of greater Boston. Now, what people have found, they can actually have a lower cost of living and a lower cost of doing business in, by the way, a lot of people call it Worcester. I don't claim to be the do-all, end-all of all this stuff, but Worcester is where a lot of the second potential is going. Now, if I were doing a startup practice and I didn't want to have a lot of competition from existing practices, Worcester's the place I'd go. The other thing is Plymouth, I think, it also has some potential, and Bristol County, Taunton, I know has some. So I'm just saying that's it. Now, when we start talking about the other parts of the state, the other places to kind of keep in mind is Springfield. Springfield is not really growing very much, but it is stable. And so that's where a lot of people from outside the state are setting up. Everybody keeps talking, by the way, in the demographic journals about how great Pittsfield is going to be. That's on the extreme western side of the state. I'll believe it when I see it. Okay, now let's talk about growth and development for a second. There are three tables that I put in this chart. And what they show, that first column is the GDP growth. And what you can see is you got, Massachusetts and New Hampshire are pretty close. You got Maine, which it's not really growing, but it's not really shrinking. And then you have some places that are having a little bit of problem. Rhode Island is one, and Connecticut is really not doing well as far as its GDP development. Now, the growth, particularly among the young people, suggests that New Hampshire is doing fairly well. Even Rhode Island, surprisingly, isn't doing badly, but Connecticut, not doing so well. And then the net migration, where people are moving from, Vermont and Connecticut, seem to be attracting a lot of people from outside the United States. Now, I'm not really going to say that that's good or that's bad. I'm just saying the reality. The reality is, if you want to get a practice that's really going to grow, this is the market for you to consider. Now, let me just define the terms for a second. Oh gosh, I shouldn't have done that one. Let's go back here and look at the GDP growth. This is essentially a 3-year rolling average. It captures trends between 2014 and 17. Generally speaking, GDP growth is not doing particularly well in most parts of New England, I'll be honest. The growth of young people is another kind of problem because 25 to 29-year-olds are not permanent in this area. Massachusetts has kind of got the bank on the number of people who are coming in who are that young age. The problem is young people don't stay in Massachusetts after they've gotten their education. So they'll come, get their, cut their teeth on a 3 to 5 year new job, and then they'll leave. And they'll leave because the cost of living is very high here. Now, net migration, again, it's a 3-year rolling average. It's international and domestic, but for all intents and purposes, New England is a place of net migration from foreign countries. Now, let's talk about that thing, why people don't stick around. And you got to consider taxes. As I mentioned, 4 out of the 10 highest tax states are here. Maine is the number 1. Now, Maine gets lots of ways of getting it. Property tax is probably highest among any. But Vermont is right behind it. And so is Connecticut. Now, here's the thing that was a little sad. Connecticut, as I may mention later, had the highest median household income in the United States for decades, until the 70s and then into the 80s, where they decided to really tax people because they thought, raise the taxes, we can afford more stuff, and they made a lot of investments in the state that didn't really pay off. Rhode Island, on the other hand, has the idea, we don't really have much, so what the heck? What are you going to leave? Ironically, a lot of practices that were in Rhode Island decided to jump across the border to eastern Connecticut and have seemed to do pretty well because the cost of living and the cost of doing business went down. Now, I know, I'm throwing around a lot of numbers and I apologize for it, but I just want you to have something that you can hang your hat on. The tax situation, unless it's resolved, is going to be a problem. All right, let's talk about the immigration issue. Now, within the country, and I referred to this earlier, the lowest birth rate in the United States is New England. Highest is going to be in the western Rocky Mountain places, including Utah, where we happen to live. What this chart shows you is that while the native population has increased, the rate of increase of immigrants has been crazy high. So while the native population increased by 11.7% between 1970 and 2017, migration is what, or immigration is what they've really had to depend on. And that's what is kind of scary, because New England is so dependent upon the growth rate of other places. Now let's do a couple of observations. I don't want to get too long here, but I just have to say a few things. If you want a practice for sale, go to Greater Boston. And I say Greater Boston, then it takes in Worcester. It's just because the number of practices is so great. The economy there is doing reasonably well. So the value of these practices is still going to hold up pretty well. My broker friends continue to tell me, yeah, Greater Boston's still a place to go. If you want to have a startup practice, you want to go to Vermont or Worcester. Now you say, why Vermont? Well, it's primarily because there are some areas that are underserved within Vermont. You kind of have to look town by town on where those places might be. Now, if you want to have a geriatric practice, you're looking for the old people, maybe some old people with money, Maine's the place to go. Now, here's the thing. Within the United States, the median age is about, well, it depends on where you go. It's roughly 33, 34 years of age. In Maine, it's about 48 years old. It creates a problem because people who want to sell their house don't necessarily have young families who want to move into Maine to have them. There's other reasons why people don't want to go to Maine. But on the other hand, the percentage of elderly is very high within Maine. Also, if you want to go to a place where there's a lot of turnover, a lot of churning, downtown Boston's the place to go. And that's because that churning rate is going to be more than 50% of people will live there less than 3 years. With that kind of turnover, even an established practice will get a whole new group of neighbors who will move in if you happen to be in downtown Boston. Now, if you want to make a high return on your investment, but it's also highly risky, Boston is also a good place to go. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about Greater Boston. Now, you can go to, well, I won't mention the specific places except to say Boston has several pockets of very affluent people who are moving in. And therefore, they're a good group to go after, especially if you want to have high production and have people who have very good credit. But also be aware it's crowded, and there are going to be other people who are going to be in the area. Now, let me talk to you about the services that we offer, and this might be the best seminar for us to talk about this. There are 4 services we have that people looking around might want to use, and one of them is the state briefing. We only charge about $49 to get a state briefing. It involves a breakdown of all of the cities and counties within any particular state. So again, $49 each. There's also a narration of me as I go through and kind of explain what I'm seeing within each state. Sometimes the narrations are not really new, but the data is done every year. It's new. More often than not, though, what people are saying is, I want a telephone consult. And that's because I've got a brother-in-law who's offering me a job in New Hampshire. How should I go or not? Well, the telephone consultation is specific to you and that location. It can be ordered in very short time, and it's only $225. And I'll look at the data in the area and be able to talk to you, like on this video conference, about what's happening there. The best sites report is when you find a large, often multi-county area, and you're saying, where's the best place of opportunity? The best sites report is a really, really good tool for that. We'll look at several counties and tell you the 5 sites that are going to be most reflective of what you want. And then once you find that, we can do an evaluation to say, does a practice site make sense here? But it's not the cheapest demographic report out there. It's actually, however, the deepest, because it provides not only data, but the practice site viability report includes commentary and discussion about the specific area and why it's good and why it might not be good for you. So let me just kind of say, okay, I'm going to say something before I get too much off this. You guys, when it comes to New England, if I were saying what state should I really look at, you got to kind of consider New Hampshire as being the hidden gem. New Hampshire has a lot going for it, has a lot going as far as its infrastructure, the attitude of people. Businesses consider going there. New Hampshire's good. Boston, greater Boston, but Massachusetts overall, safe because there's so many people, but it's more competition. Places not to go, I'd be very, very careful about Rhode Island, where everybody is looking for the exits. Be careful of Connecticut, unless you get a report. And I say that particular site has promise because it may not. And just generally speaking, Vermont has got a real socialist bent. I won't tell you who the presidential candidate running, who happens to be a senator from Vermont, but that's an attitude that exists here, okay? Don't forget, that's a reflection. Now, Miracle Max 49 is a discount that we're offering for those who watch our podcast. Please take advantage of it. If you don't, maybe you don't deserve it. Now, Mike, what do you have to say about any of these places that I've talked about?
I don't know what I would say, honestly, Scott. I think you've covered it fantastic. I think the only thing that I would maybe add would just be that the more complex an area is, the more you need a report. And when we're talking, I was just in Connecticut, actually, not that long ago, a few months ago. Connecticut, Massachusetts, went for a drive actually from Connecticut to Boston. You're right. It's beautiful. It's very desirable in that way, but there are a lot of complexities that are happening in both the population centers and the outskirting areas that can make your practice really suffer if you don't play the right hand that's dealt to you. And so that's why that practice viability, the best sides report, is so important, because you're going to be able to understand how those complexities are going to play into the strategy of your practice, and then be able to deploy the right methods, the right message to the community. So important. And really with this discount, the Miracle Max 49, which you can apply to these reports, it's really the best time ever to do it.
Well, I absolutely agree. And by the way, in the fall, I'm going to try to head out to New England again. Well, it's a tax-deductible drive. It's a trip. And it is just lovely. But I got to tell you, right now we're finding one little characteristic I forgot to mention. A lot of people are retiring. They're leaving. They're not sticking around New England. And so that is a disadvantage that the area is having. However, there's a lot of people who are deciding, I need to be around smart people. And that's why Greater Boston and general Massachusetts, we're seeing a lot of that. And also New Hampshire. Connecticut has got just a boatload of smart folks. So I'm just saying that's why those areas continue to be considered for brand new national headquarters. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that little tangent, but let us know how we can tell you about where to go and how to evaluate.
How do they get a hold of us?
They can call us at 800-424-6222 or contact us at info@drdemographics.com. The website is probably the smartest way to go. All of our prices are listed on our reports. You can get free samples. And trust me, it's a good thing. Oh, last little thing, sorry. We get inundated at certain times of the year, and we're kind of in one of those areas, times a year, which it's likely to get kind of slammed. If you have something you want done soon, don't wait. We'd love to be able to help you, but we only have so much time to be able to do it. Because we don't automate all this stuff. It actually is a real analyst who does it. An analyst like Mike, who is looking a little bit like Curly Joe in the Three Stooges, just a little bit. That's all I'm saying.
Ouch.
You know that thing you do?
Ouch. I know exactly. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Everybody, thanks so much. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Rocky Mountains. States that people don't often associate with the Rockies, and that's going to include Idaho. Colorado, Wyoming, anyway, those states that have the big mountains and are showing also serious growth potential, especially if you love outdoor recreation. So everybody, thanks so much, and we'll be talking to you again soon.